So, welcome. It throws me using this new camera. I think I'm live. So, welcome to this week's Optimum Health Clinic Facebook Live. And this week, I wanted to continue in the spirit of exploring some of the mental patterns that we identify in ME, chronic fatigue, and fibromyalgia. And these are really thought patterns to look out for that can either cause us to just waste a lot of energy being caught in the structure of the pattern, but can also often cause us to make bad decisions on the recovery path. So can cause us, for example, to push through when we shouldn't be pushing through, or can cause us to get caught in a state of analysis paralysis where we get so caught kind of going round and round and round that we can't be clear and objective in terms of what we actually should be doing. So we already have looked at mental tennis, and we looked at Windows ME. I think that might have been last week. And this week I wanted to explore the inner critic. Now, this kind of short, kind of 5-10 minute Facebook Live is an attempt to amalgamate a huge amount of information down to just something simple to work with. So I'm going to have to just cut some corners in terms of all the pieces and background around this. For those of you that have done things like the 90-day program or the online conscious transformation program, you will have gone much more into this. So it might serve as a useful reminder of some key bits. For those of you having not gone through those pieces, it should be a good introduction. So the inner critic is really that voice inside of our mind, which is constantly judging and assessing our value as a human being. So let's say, for example, that we are sitting talking with some friends, and one of them says, so how are you doing? And we try to communicate and articulate how we're feeling on our recovery process. Perhaps we don't feel as coherent and as clear as we might normally be. And then that voice starts inside of our mind saying, you sound silly, they think you're making it up, you're not communicating clearly, people always think that you're stupid or whatever. So we start judging ourselves and beating ourselves up. Or it can be as simple as we wake up in the morning and we recognize we've not had a great night's sleep, and perhaps we did a bit too much the day before, and that voice starts saying, you're always overdoing it, you're never going to get this right, you're never going to recover. So it's that constant voice that, by the way, predates ME chronic fatigue post-date ME chronic fatigue, that is constantly judging and assessing us. And that voice is extremely draining and tiring. Sometimes there can be a grain of truth in what the voice, sometimes there's not at all, but sometimes there is a grain of truth in what the voice is trying to say. But the way that the feedback is delivered via the inner critic makes it very difficult to act on any of that feedback. So for example, let's say, we're a writer and our editor gives us some feedback on some writing. If they're crushing in the way they deliver that feedback, it's very hard to respond to it. If they deliver it in such a way that's not judgmental and assessing our value as a human being, it's just information, it's much easier to engage in that. And what the inner critic tends to do is it tends to take and hijack the experiences and things happening in our life and turns them into weapons and ways to start judging us, beating us up, and attacking us. And the result is, apart from the fact it's energy depleting and draining and it feels horrible and terrible, often it causes us to make bad decisions, because often we find ourselves making decisions in reaction against our inner critic. So our inner critic says that we're rubbish, we're stupid, we're terrible, we're lazy. So then we try and push ourselves to compensate against the inner critic, to try and prove our self-worth, and as a result, we end up crashing or doing too much or whatever else. The way we tend to deal with the inner critic is we tend to either be rationalizing, so it's almost like mental tennis. We're going backwards and forwards, debating our self-worth with our inner critic. Or we end up doing a kind of sod you and just screw you and kind of do it exactly the opposite of what it's telling us to do. Or we tend to collapse and get caught in this place of feeling just very small and judged and beaten up. The problem is whichever of those we choose to do, whether we rationalize, we fight, or we collapse, we are still caught in engagement with the inner critic. What we want to be able to do is disengage. A little bit like the example I gave in the video on mental tennis. We're watching, our inner critic saying, you're terrible, you're rubbish, you're awful. We're saying, no, I'm not, I'm great, I did this thing. We're going backwards and forwards. We just end the attack and we end the engagement with it. So it's like putting down the tennis racket and walking off the tennis court. And sometimes just being almost rude to our inner critic, going like, F you, sod you, screw you. Not screw you, I'm a great, wonderful person and getting caught back in rationalizing, but just a disengagement and walking away. Or almost visualizing inside of our mind, seeing our inner critic as this kind of annoying kind of monkey or whatever, and just getting a tennis racket and kind of whacking it away. Whatever we do, and there's a whole kind of teaching and a whole kind of body of work of how to work with this, but whatever we do, we need to find a way to disengage from that voice. That voice is draining, depleting, causes us to make bad decisions, and ultimately, it doesn't help and support us. If we can take away the judgment of the voice, we're able to get the feedback if we need the feedback. So what I thought would be helpful for the purpose of this Facebook Live would be just for you guys to start having more awareness of what's happening with your inner critic. To maybe share in the comments with each other, maybe if you want to do it privately with yourself, but some of the ways that you judge and beat yourselves up. Because although self-awareness isn't necessarily the only piece we need to change it, a phrase I often use is, if you can see it, you don't have to be it. So the more awareness you have of what's happening, the easier it is to go, hang on a second, I'm judging myself up, I'm beating myself up, I'm giving myself a hard time, that's unhelpful, I'm going to stop doing that. Sometimes we can make that choice just by seeing what's happening. But we have to, there's a kind of model called RID, we have to recognize, identify, defend, and disengage. So there's a whole piece of work around that, but if we can start with recognizing we're being attacked and identifying the attack, that alone can be really useful. So I appreciate this is one of those things where just doing a kind of 5-10 minute video is not enough to go fully into it, but I hope that's given you some starting points. Share your experience. Let me know topics you'd like me to cover on future videos. If you're not already a patient of the clinic, you want to find out more, a great way to do so is request a free information pack at theoptimumhealthclinic.com. You can also request a free 15-minute chat with one of the practitioners in either the psychology or the nutrition department. It's a great way to find out more if we might be able to help you. So I hope that's been useful, and I will talk with you again next week.